Good morning. Professor James Heckman, Professor Chang-Xin Li, Provost and Deputy President of City University of Hong Kong, esteemed colleagues, friends, and fellow students. I'm Professor Zheng Wang, Associate Vice President, Strategic Research of CityU Hong Kong. First, I would like to welcome you all to this inaugural lecture of the Distinguished Lecture Series on Global Sustainability. This is also one of the many events to celebrate the 30th anniversary of our university. CityU Hong Kong is dedicated to embracing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through its efforts in education, research, and knowledge and technology transfer. This lecture series aims to shed light on global economic and social development issues with a particular emphasis on sustainability as the guiding principle for the future. We encourage knowledge exchange and interdisciplinary dialogue for sustainable development and social responsibility in Hong Kong and beyond. Today, we are very honored to have distinguished presence of Professor James Heckman, Nobel Laureate in Economics and Director of Center for the Economics of Human Development, the University of Chicago. Professor Heckman received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his development of theory and methods used in the analysis of individual or household behavior. Now, his passion is in promoting skill development. So he's going to give us an enlightening talk on the topic, promoting skills to promote equality and social mobility. Furthermore, it is my honor to welcome other distinguished panelists joining us today, representing various backgrounds and expertise. Their valuable perspectives will undoubtedly enrich our discussion. To begin the lecture, I would like to invite Professor Chang-Xin Li, Provost and Deputy President of CityU Hong Kong, to give a welcome remark. Professor Li, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Distinguished Lecture Series on Global Sustainability at the City University of Hong Kong. It is my great pleasure to welcome our first distinguished speaker, Professor James Heckman, a Nobel laureate and an esteemed economist from the University of Chicago. Professor Heckman's groundbreaking work in economics have profoundly influenced public policy and human development. His topic today, promoting skills to promote equality and social mobility, will definitely be an inspiring and impactful inaugural lecture. As a young and dynamic university celebrating our 30th anniversary, City University of Hong Kong is dedicated to address today's challenges with future technology. We strive to explore innovative solutions while engaging communities and stakeholders in sustainable practices. Recently, City University of Hong Kong participated in the Global Sustainable Development Congress as the event's Green Innovation Partner, demonstrated the influential role of university can play in promoting sustainability in partnership with governments and industry. We are also grateful for the exceptional panel with us today, whose diverse expertise will enrich our collective endeavor towards global sustainability. We welcome everyone to join hands in the pursuit of sustainability. Thank you.
I would like to invite our distinguished guests for the panel discussion session to come to the stage and take a group photo together. Yeah, so Professor James Heckman, our distinguished lecture speaker, Mr. Mai Lu, former Vice Chairman and Secretary General, China Development Research Foundation. Mr. Leung Chong, Chief Strategy Officer, Exchange Fund Investment Office, Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Mr. Joseph Laban-Se, Council Member of CityU Hong Kong. And Professor Kellogg Chen, Dean of the College of Business, CityU Hong Kong. Thank you all.
Now we are going to have a big group photo together.
Thank you all. Now it's the moment. May I invite Professor James Heckman to come to the stage and deliver his distinguished lecture. Hey, Professor Heckman, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't realize the significance of this lecture as being the very first in a series, and I hope it gets off to a good start. I'll try to make that happen. I am going to talk today about something that's very much relevant to the topic of global sustainability here in Hong Kong, but also in the world at large, and what would be needed to think about building a future world, a current and future world, that will actually lead to prosperity and opportunity for individuals in the larger society, all segments of society. I'm actually very delighted to be here with two of my colleagues, my research colleagues on this project, actually. Lu Mai, who's here from the CDRF, he deserves a great round of applause as a hero, really, of Chinese society. And my co-author, Zhou Zhen, who is a member of the faculty now at City University, and we've been working very actively, along with Lu Mai, in creating a skill base and creating knowledge. So the research programs that we're talking about today, as well as the interventions today, bring together not only practical knowledge about good ideas to promote the next generation welfare in China, rural China in particular, but in China generally, but also lead to really deeper understanding of skills and skill formation than has been available in the past. So it's a combination that's very healthy, that puts together both research and policy in a very active way. And one of the major foundations of my own thinking, and I think the thinking of the whole project in this, is that we can combine these two tasks effectively, and by doing a good research base, creating it, we can essentially create much better policy. So let me try to explain. First of all, what I want to talk about today is a very general overview of what modern understanding is about skills and skill formation. There's been a lot of change in the way we think about skills in the last 50, 60 years. It maybe doesn't seem that remarkable when I mention it, but as you will see, it does actually affect the way that policy is to be conducted. And most importantly, the way we evaluate the success of different policies and different institutions. So let me just make a claim here, which I think is very important, which is that if we want to tackle these aspects of poverty, inequality, and social mobility, it's very important that we focus on aspects of skills. There's a great deal of emphasis in the global workplace, global journalism on inequality, work by people like Piketty and others, Saez, focusing mostly on capital accumulation and inheritance of money as being the central way of creating and reducing inequality. But I think what's missing in a lot of that agenda is really understanding skills. Skills are very, very important. And they're more important than we make them out to be. Actually, one of the more recent findings by one of my colleagues at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business has been that one of the most important sources of growth of hedge funds, and we think of as financial capital, has much more to do with human capital than it has to do with physical capital in the usual way. Physical capital is accumulated, but if you look, for example, at successful hedge fund builders like Ken Griffin, or so, who actually has helped endow a lot of activities at the University of Chicago. But if you listen to Griffin and his conversations, he will talk about the importance in his team of building a very smart group of highly interactive individuals, very well trained, who will engage each other, they will interact with each other, they will challenge, and they will try new ideas out. They'll try them out on each other, and they'll try them out in the market. And so human capital plays a very fundamental role in a way that we traditionally have not analyzed. By we, I mean economists. And so what I want to talk about is a little bit of what's well known and maybe even boring for some of you, but I want to build on this and show you some ways to operate on this knowledge in an effective way. So one thing we've learned a lot, and this is a huge change from 100 years ago. A long time ago, 100 years ago or so, if we'd come here at a conference on skills and we had talked a lot about differences in human beings, one of the major themes would have been genetics, eugenics. Eugenics was the rage. Very smart people like Bertrand Russell and a large group of people like him and many others, very influential people, were convinced that the differences among us were largely genetically determined, and that we start with these matters at birth, and these genes are all powerful. And that led to a whole class of social policies, which in some ways were very unhealthy, and which I think really are contradicted by the evidence that we've assembled, and I'll show you in what way they're contradicted. And so what we've come to understand is something that in the first point is the gaps in skills open up very early. And this is true across all environments, whether or not we're dealing in remote Colombia, in South America, whether or not we're dealing in rural China, in very remote regions, or in New York City, for that matter. Gaps open up very early. But what we've come to understand is how these skills are much more malleable. And we've come to understand how we come to learn. There is a role for genetic components, and there's a modern study of genetics called, this whole study of GWAS and the analysis of called polygenic scores has come to give us a much deeper understanding, but still provisional understanding of the role of genetics. But even when we look for the genetics and we control for the genetics in various ways, we still see a very powerful role of influence of environments, family environments, social environments, environments in the workplace and at school. So we really need to understand that. And we need to understand how skills evolve and can be shaped in a substantial way. And so that's the nature of the knowledge I want to transmit today and just summarize. This graph has been replicated in many, many environments. This is now US data, but I could give you a similar plot from Hong Kong, another plot in Colombia, a plot that's true in many other, in rural India and so forth. And what you see is two remarkable features in this graph. First of all, you can see what does it show? It shows achievement scores. So this is a measure that many of us use to think about how well children are performing. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, we starts at age 3 and goes to age 18, about the time children are deciding to go to college. And we can see that children of more advantaged parents, those are the college graduates, generally have higher test scores throughout, before they start at school, throughout school, and then on the way to college, if they go to college. And those who are children of dropouts, more disadvantaged children, those gaps are there early on and they remain persistent. And what's remarkable about this figure is that this is American data. And American data are very unequal in terms of the schools and so forth that these children get. So you might think, well, the disadvantaged kids go to increasingly worse schools and that should widen the gaps. But in fact, that's not been the case in many studies. So there's this gap. But secondly, the thing that's interesting is the gap starts early and then ends up. Now, does this contradict genetics? No, it doesn't. You could literally say people who are born of more educated parents have a better genetic stock, And they're the ones who actually they start strong and they end strong up through 18. And the same thing at the bottom. But what I want to convince you today is that that's not true. And that this powerful influence of early environment and the parental environment is not determinative to the extent that we think it is. And genetics is not the whole story. In fact, it's far from the story. So what I'm proposing today in terms of a global strategy is that we capitalize on a growing knowledge about life cycle skill formation. And I think that's very important that we understand that. Now, there are two key observations that are really important to put on the table. And this is something that's not fully recognized, certainly not in China, not if you go to the OECD or ILO conferences that are held quite often and promoted by many NGOs and various organizations. Namely, that PISA scores, which China takes great pride in, Shanghai scores are none the best in the world. Nonetheless, these scores capture only a small part of life-relevant skills. And we've come to measure those, and there's a very active research being done on that. Some of this by the project here with CDRF. And so when we think about what predicts success in life, it's much more than IQ. You know, there was an old phrase said, well, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Well, we know why, because there are a lot of attributes that essentially guarantee success. And as we come to, but I say that, we all know it's true. But what's important, and when you listen to what I'm saying today, is say, yes, a lot of this is obvious. I think it is. It should be. But it's not built into public policy. It's not built into the way we think about evaluating schools. It's not the way we build into think about even designing programs to promote welfare of children. So the first point I want to make is there are multiple measures, and I'll talk about those measures. But I think the second part is very important too, and that is something that has been taken for granted in many countries. Namely, the early years, namely the time before children start school, are extremely important. And that's really an important message for several reasons. One is not only the fact that it is important, skills emerge, a huge body of work in neuroscience, very exciting work about literally with new brain scans and new technology out, we can actually see the formation of neurons, gray matter, the creation of how it is, connectivity is established, and that starts at the earliest ages. In fact, it starts in the womb, even before the child is born. So we actually then have a much deeper understanding about the role of the early years in providing the stimulation that either fosters or retards the development of early neural formation, the capacities that we have to think and reason. Now, I'm not going to say that it's all settled at age 3 or age 5 or any such thing. It's not true. The human brain shows plasticity into the 80s and 90s, no question about it. But the fact of the matter is those early years are particularly important because they create the base for later years. That's the obvious part. What we've come to understand is exactly how they work and how we might go about drawing on that knowledge. Now, there's a really crucial policy issue which needs to be addressed, and people frequently ignore these questions. If you look at the policy discussions in my own country, in the United States, you'll hear a lot of discussions that arise in a natural way. I mean, for example, if there's a crime problem, as there is in many cities in the United States, the question is, how do we attack that crime problem? Hire more police, do things that essentially would make it more difficult for criminals to engage in activity. So the natural aspect that many politicians and business leaders and many social leaders will want to approach is basically to solve problems as they arise. And in some sense, that's efficient. Why tackle a problem that we don't even know exists? And so the statement in the United States, the phrase is only the squeaky wheel gets the grease. We turn our attention to where the problem manifests itself. That may be a good strategy, but it also may be a very unwise strategy. And I want to suggest that in some areas of human development, it's very unwise. That we've come to a deeper understanding of when these problems that blossom in later life start to emerge and how we might eliminate them. And I want to show you some evidence of effective strategies that allow us to essentially address those questions and have been shown to be very effective. So then the real question, the practical question then for this conversation today is early prevention efficient? In the early years, and I mean not just at age 0 to 3, but throughout all of childhood, adolescent years, and so forth and so on. But I guess the question is, as a social policy planners, as people trying to devise a flourishing society, how well can we target and avoid problems? And here, what we have is some very interesting research that's been done, and it's typical of a large body of research. There's work that's been done looking at a survey, a long longitudinal survey of children in New Zealand. Started some 45 years ago in a town called Dunedin, and then followed to this day. And what this cohort of children, large city, relatively large city, these children are followed over their lifetimes, and we can then see, it's not an experiment, it's not a study where there's any direct intervention, but we can see the emergence of certain kinds of social problems and certain kinds of opportunities and skills. And so what we actually, and what Caspi and Moffat and others have actually shown in a series of remarkable papers is a principle which they call the Pareto principle, after the famous economist and sociologist Pareto, namely that 80% of social problems are really due to about 20% of the population. So when we think about population, you know, it's not we don't have very affluent people generally robbing gas stations and stores. And what you're finding is that this population is highly localized. This population is highly localized, and we can basically come up with reliable indicators of where future problems might emerge. Now, that's not enough. Maybe it's just going to happen genetically, and there's nothing we can do about it. And what I want to suggest is we can do something about it. But nonetheless, if you look at this, Caspi and Moffat in a paper published some years ago now in Nature Human Behavior have shown that there's a large predictable component of early life indications, early year indications, for which children are going to be at risk and impose a burden on the rest of society. And so this, for example, if we look at age 3, which is already late, but to look at age 3, you can look at things, not only IQ, but language tests, motor skills, behavioral control. We can see telltale signs of which children are at risk. And we could target those children and do it in a constructive way, not remove them, not punish them, but essentially create strategies to foster their skills and give them more richer lives that they might otherwise lead. But this is their data. This is New Zealand data now. And so what it says is, look, we have a target group of 22%, same 22%, by the way, and that group is counting for like 66% of all the social welfare in New Zealand, 77% of the fatherless children, 81% of the crime, and on and on and on in terms of problems that are social, medical, and society-wide problems. So there is some notion that there is a target population at risk. So at least we can identify risk factors. And then there's another group of people who are very low risk, and those are people generally associated with healthier home environments, more secure environments, parenting, and the like. I'll get to what I think are the determinants of those factors. So that's one factor. So there is a group, a target group that's out there, and we can use that target group as a way to aim and try to think about how to improve, to avoid some of those problems that I listed and many other problems as well. But now come back to this theme, that skills. Most of the international organizations have focused on schooling. My own president of the United States, Obama, and previous presidents have actually focused a lot on the idea that everybody should go to college, that all college and that academic skills are the only skills that are really relevant. But what we've come to understand, and I think when I say we've come to understand, I don't think we ever lost sight of it. I think we only lost sight of it in public policy. Public policy became obsessed with the fruits of cognitive psychology, but not the other aspects. So, for example, in the United States in the 19th century, one of the readers that all American children learned from was something called McGuffey's Reader. Probably haven't heard about it, it's an old. But if you look at the McGuffey Reader of the 1880s and 1890s, you realize what they're teaching is more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're also teaching lessons of character, lessons of self-control, lessons of restraint, a whole variety of lessons that we put under the notion of character and personality skills. And those are turn out in a whole series of studies, some of which I've conducted, but have been put together in a broad array by psychologists and by economists working together and separately to show that these other skills are very predictive. And so we've come to understand, for example, and again, I think this is, since at an intuitive level, I don't think this is very profound. I think this is, in some sense, my guess is that everybody, a good grandmother in the 1700s would have understood this. So it's not like we're saying something profound, but it's profound relative to where public policy is today. Because in the mid-1950s and 1960s, especially in the early part of the 20th century when the IQ test was developed, society developed a fixation on IQ, and IQ and intelligence as being the main avenue of promoting achievement and success. And we also have come to understand these social and emotional skills are highly important. And I give you a list of these skills. There are a lot of them, I think you'll all agree, are skills that enable people to lead flourishing lives. But also you'll see at the very bottom, and one of the skills that's only received attention recently is something that psychologists call executive functioning. It's very closely related to IQ. But it's not IQ in the sense of just doing a Raven's test abstractly. It's the ability to adapt to change and to job complexity, to recognize a problem, to break the problem down into components that can be resolved, and then to address those problems. So actually, even at the Educational Testing Service at Princeton, I had the pleasure of going there recently, fairly recently, and they showed me how they're replacing things like the graduate record and SAT exam, which dominate a lot of thinking and a lot of influence in American education and world education. They're replacing with tests which essentially test the ability of an individual to have this kind of capacity to recognize and deal with problems. And that is the essential skill, an essential skill for the modern world, because we're dealing with change. There's a lot of adaptation that's required, and more than the ability to just solve, some calculus problem is the ability to actually deal with problems as they arise, executive functioning, and to cope with those problems. And they're developing mechanisms for trying to elicit those skills in various capacities. So what we see from a very large body of work, I don't have time to go through all the evidence, but I can send you to the body of evidence, that things like crime, earnings, health, civic participation, teenage pregnancy, trust, human agency, all of these factors all these outcomes are predicted by these character skills that I mentioned earlier. So we know that in terms of creating what are successful lives, IQ explains like 4 to 5, maybe as much as 8 or 9% of the variability in lifetime earnings, present value. But a lot of these other skills play a very powerful role as well. And we know that intuitively, but now we formalized it. What we don't know it yet is in the way we evaluate school systems. PISA scores are still widely trumpeted. So people are fired or hired on the basis of how well their schools are producing PISA scores. It might also be useful to think about hiring and firing people on the basis of how well they produce these other human skills that promote flourishing. So that's one ingredient of the modern understanding. A second understanding, and this is more relevant, I think, maybe in the United States than in China, although it still matters in China because of the problem of left behind children, especially the migration from the West to the East. And that's the importance of family environments in shaping skills. And when we think about what families do, we have to understand that families are much more than just giving resources in the sense of just feeding the child. most of what parenting is about and what family influence is about is engaging the child. The way that psychologists sometimes describe this, and economists now, is scaffolding, where you take a child and you take a child with the skills, with a certain curiosity, a certain ability, and find out where the child is at, and then advance the child in a way that's very specific to where the knowledge, where the child is at, and engage the parent and the school and other influences on the child in finding where the child's at and then trying to promote and take the child to the next step. But the family influence is much more about attachment and relationships between the child and the parent. And the work that's being done by CDRF and this work in the whole study of China Reach, which I'll talk about in a bit, actually does exactly that. It promotes the family life in a much more active way. It's teaching, ironically, when you think about trying to help disadvantaged children in Western China, it's not just a matter of sending them books or just giving them money. It's much more about engaging the parent in the life of the child and then watching the child develop and watching the parent develop, as a matter of fact, in producing more successful children. And that's a major finding, I think, in terms of understanding how skills are formed. But let me just show you. This is an old study. I'll show you a more recent one. But this is one that's very widely cited. Again, I hope I'm not boring you, but I think these are useful things to just review before I get to the newer part of this talk. And that is what we've come to understand. You saw those gaps that were there. But we can, in terms of the abilities of children measured by this one achievement test. But if you look at children stratified by the lower strata families, welfare families, working class and professional families, if you just look at that table on top, you'll see there's a big difference in the verbal environment and the parenting environment that these children possess. They've had very different kinds of frameworks of parenting, very different childhoods are experienced. And so the more professional families are speaking to the children, speaking among themselves and also engaging the children, and they're doing about 3 to 4 times more many words per hour than the more disadvantaged families. And the nature of the parenting is much more affirmation, like encouraging the child to try things, to engage. I mean, one thing we've come to learn about child development, and I think it's true about everything we engage in society, is that failure is an important part of learning. And parenting is an important part about protecting children from the downside of failure, but encourage them to go try and fail and try new things. So we always want curiosity. I remember I was once at a conference in Chicago, a meeting that the mayor of Chicago called with Jack Ma from Alibaba. And he made a statement saying, I have this group in Chicago and I have this university at Alibaba, and what I'm doing is teaching people how to fail. Everybody looked around, what do you mean fail? And exactly this sense about learning, trying new ideas, willing to experiment and try. With children, that's even more important in some level. But the failure also has to be met with a response of resilience, giving them encouragement, showing them that the failure doesn't mean a permanent trait, but it gives them some permanent failure, but it's just a chance to try and try again. So, and then this is a more recent version of this from a group at Stanford, but it's more or less the same thing, that home environments play a huge role. But it's not just the verbal environment, it's the nature of parenting. I'll come back to that. So what do we know about this? Well, there are 2 notions. I'll come back to social Darwinism very briefly. First of all, one fact is true. The return on investment is greater for more capable people. If you ask who should go to college at age 18, should it be the dumb people or should it be the smart people? I think we all know the answer. We think the smart people will probably benefit more unless they have an attitude problem. So we generally find higher returns for more capable people. And so many people will stop right there and say, oh, look, that's where, that's it. That's the whole thing. The whole story is that if they're born dumb and they stay dumb, there's not much we can do about it. And whole books have been written about that. Even recently, in the United States, There was a book written by Murray on the bell curve that essentially said this. But what we've come to understand is the dynamics of human skill formation. And this is something that's new, that we're just beginning to understand. We have some new and exciting knowledge, which I'll try to share with you. Namely, this notion of dynamic complementarity. Namely, that we can say, okay, you do start with kids who are major disadvantage problems. They come in environments that are poor, the parents aren't as rich, aren't as healthy, they aren't reading to the children. Is there anything we can do? And the answer is yes, we can supplement the environments. And so what we've come to understand, precisely because we've moved away from the biology, the biological determinism, is that if we invest in the young children today, disadvantaged children, there's a huge return. And the simple reason is that the nature of learning is cumulative. And it's more than just that it adds up. It's that it's dynamic. That the more you learn, the easier it is to learn down the road. And you can actually see that in some of the work by the neuroscientists about people who acquire more skills generally have a neural capacity which enables them to learn more. So learning begets learning, and there's a dynamism there which has not made its way yet into understanding public policy. So the point is we can then think about trying to promote equality. Even if children start in a disadvantaged way, we can build a skill base that makes them effective and that overcomes what initial advantages they may have been born into. And so the accident of birth can play a much less powerful role if we're careful in thinking about how we build skills. And so there is something about this dynamism which is very, very important. How social and emotional skills interact with each other. Health plays a very important role in a way that people typically ignore. That it's kind of obvious unhealthy children can't really learn much, but on the other hand, cognitive skills produce better health, and so forth and so on. And so there's a dynamism which I think we need to capture in public policy. So the nation is to build skills to benefit from this later life static complementarity. So yes, more capable children will learn from college, but we can build less capable children at a young age to a more capable level for entry into college. So we can essentially equalize. We can provide a true meaning of equal opportunity. And so this graph, it's an old graph now, but it's showing where investments, it's a thought experiment. This is not an empirical relationship. So don't say that prenatal programs must have a much higher return. They're very strong job training programs. This is a thought experiment. What it's saying is that if you have the first RMB, where would you invest it? In the earliest years or in the later years? The logic is the earliest years, because you're building the skill base. You're using this dynamic complementarity. And then that makes and the reason why it's so effective is that precisely because when you get to the college and job training years, your skill base is much higher, and you're able to get very high returns. So you build that skill base. But you need to build the skill base early, and that's where the dynamics comes in. So there's a lot of evidence for effective early intervention. So now I want to switch over to a more practical notion of putting the ideas to test and to suggest what some policies that are being done currently in China today and ways that are helping the Chinese nation. So what I want to provide you is with some long-run evidence on the effects of quality early interventions. Now, there's a large literature on early childhood. Many of you have been party to it. A lot of NGOs support these programs. The typical practice in this literature is for somebody to run a program and a year or two later to evaluate it and to stop and say it works. Who cares about this? This is not something you would do if you were running a business. If you were trying to build a product, you would ask, well, am I going to be in business 20 years from now? Not, am I in good shape 6 months from now? And so what I want to draw on today is body of evidence that shows that intervening in the lives of disadvantaged children promotes these skills and has long-term effects. And I'm going to show how long-term the effects are. because we have a study that we've been involved in at the University of Chicago, along with a group in Ypsilanti, Michigan, that has actually been going on for some 55 years. So I have children who are disadvantaged at age 3 and 4 in the 1960s, and we now know what their data are, and not only what their data are, but what their children's data are. So we then can follow them into their later life and into the children's life. So we can then see what are the benefits of this. So this is not speculation. This is something that's really quite so forth. So the one thing I will insist on, though, and I think this has ruined a lot of the literature and made this kind of controversial in some areas, especially in my own country, that people will talk about this program or that program or not. What we really need to understand are what the fundamentals are that give rise to that powerful role of early intervention and where we can activate the family and get the highest benefits. So I just talked about the Perry Project. This is a project, I'll just review it briefly. It's very interesting. It suggests a promise. It's very expensive, though. So let me just explain. It starts at age 3. These are disadvantaged, all African-American children in a little city outside of Detroit, just to the west of Detroit. 2 hours a day for 2 years during the school year. And the children were brought into this program, and briefly, just kind of in a cursory way, what the children were brought into was a program where the kids came in each day, they planned a task, they executed a task, and then they reviewed the task under the guidance of some teachers. So there was this close interaction with the teacher. There was also a visit with the family, and so the parents were also engaged. When we look at this program, and these people then were done, these people entered the program in the 1960s, and we can follow these people then into their late 50s, we find that if we look at the annual rate of return per dollar invested, you get a 10% rate of return per annum. That's after taxes and transfers. So that's accounting for all the distortion that comes from public sector revenue. So literally speaking, we know that when you raise taxes, you're going to create distortions. This 10% is net of those distortions. And one major ingredient is that non-cognitive factors, these social and emotional factors, are greatly enhanced. So I mentioned externalizing behavior. I also mentioned executive functioning. Externalizing behavior is this tendency towards violence. And one thing that Caspi and Moffat found, particularly Terry Moffat, she's a psychologist who did this Dunedin study I talked about earlier, one thing that Moffat found was that the emergence of violent criminal behavior, it turns out, starts to manifest itself at ages 3 and 4. It's through what's called externalizing behavior, very aggressive behavior. Now, the people in Perry didn't know. The Moffat study came 20 years later, so it just so happened they picked the right age to get targeting those children where these skills, where these behaviors were emerging. And what we did is the treated group got actually lower. The scale looks a little weird because it looks like we're shifting the distribution to the right. But what's going on here is actually the externalizing behavior is going down. So the scale is kind of perverse. So. And then the children are also more academically motivated. So even if their IQs didn't go up, they were much more likely to engage in the school and get higher grades and do higher achievement test scores. So if you look at what constitutes an achievement test score, it's not just IQ, it's acquired knowledge. And even for the same IQ, these children are actually doing much better on achievement test scores, PISA scores. And then the remarkable thing is we can follow these people over into their children's lives. And then not as far out, obviously, the children are in their late 20s, early 30s, but we can still follow them. And we find that in many different dimensions, suspension from school, criminal activity, high school degrees, and so forth and so on, the children are better off the children of the treatment group members are better off than the children of the control group who never got this intervention. And you can look at a whole variety of outcomes. I won't go through all of them. I'll leave these slides behind. You can certainly read them if you are interested. But we can find very strong effects. And more importantly, it's not just the children directly and their children, but the siblings of the original participants. So the younger children who grew up in these families where the older child was in the program also benefit. So there are spillovers that are frequently not counted in a lot of these evaluations. This is something we found to be really quite important. And so if you do a benefit-cost ratio and account for these various aspects, you get ratios that are extremely high, things that are, and for example, if I look at a benefit-cost ratio and subtract all dead weight loss, I get a 7.5. 7.5 for each dollar invested, for each RMB invested. Okay. Now, one of the most remarkable things, and this goes back to the genetic point, and to me this is very interesting. In fact, it's really an essential point. If you look at this column here, this is just a relationship that tells you, look for males. Just look for the male column. You see a dark column there. The dark column is suggesting, in the control group, if you look at what the relationship is, what's the correlation between the parent, the father, and the son in terms of education? Very high. It's about 0.8, a little bit below 0.8. If you look at crime, it's also very high, about 0.3. That's in the control group. Look in the treatment group, those columns that are squashed down at the origin, that's the treatment group. That intergeneral relationship has been broken. And it's also true, to a less stark extent in some way, for females. And so the intergenerational family transmission of disadvantage is broken. There's another program that's even more comprehensive, and I won't go through it other than to point out some merits that we didn't discuss here in Perry. Namely, it's a much more intensive program, 8 hours a day. It boosts the IQ of the children. It has improved parenting practices, much richer in some ways than the other program. But here's something that people never thought about. This was a program designed to boost IQs. This was launched in the 1960s and 70s when everybody thought the IQ was the be-all and end-all of what people were. Don't forget, the whole government of Singapore was based around the IQ test. And so you can see just exactly what he missed, Lee Kuan. And this table, I could have shown it to him. He wasn't interested, so I never really bothered to. But the point is if you look at this, you can see that in the ABC project, even though it never targeted health, at age 35, the treatment group had lower blood pressure, substantially lower hypertension, much less metabolic syndrome as a precursor to diabetes, abdominal obesity somewhat reduced, cholesterol, and so forth. So there are many health advantages. And there was never, and why was that? Because they were teaching these executive functioning, the ability of self-control and regulation. And that's powerful. And so we might get a much higher return when we count all of these large-scale health benefits into the program. And so you can break it down. The program has multiple benefits and on different aspects. It's a child care program and so forth and so on. And so I won't go into all the details. But the real question comes, and here I'll conclude, we'll get to this, because the China Reach program gets to the essence. Right now, there's a large literature saying early childhood matters. And I've shown you some programs, the ABC program, the Perry program. I didn't go into great detail. But these are more like shotguns. They're doing lots of different things. So what aspect of this program is really very effective? What is the most effective way? Suppose that you had to say, look, I don't want to spend a lot of money, but I want to get at the mechanism that is effectively promoting early childhood development. And what is that mechanism? What do we know? What can we extract from this lesson? And here I want to just conclude by talking about, well, I'll skip this here, but to talk about the thing that I think is really essential about these programs. Oops. Now, what's the one thing that happened in all these successful programs? The one thing that happened in every one of these programs was the crucial role of parenting was affected. You literally had changed the relationship between the parent and the child, even though it was never the direct target. So you get all these people saying, let's give families money, we must do this, we must do that. There are whole groups of people with, it's almost like a Roman circus with everybody, selling a different product. But if you just isolate it, do the scientific task of isolating what's common, parenting played a crucial role. And the way that it works is it isolates the lives outside of the child care center. It engages the parents in the lives of the children. And so if you look at PERI, you can see that it basically enhanced, for example, the parental response to the PERI program. It basically, they became much more positive. Parental warmth increased. Authoritarianism basically decreased. And so the question became, we do know that one mechanism anyway, I didn't say it's the only mechanism, is the enhanced parenting of the family. The engagement of the child, this attachment, the scaffolding I mentioned earlier. But now it turns out there's a literature which has emerged that is now being tried out in active scale in China. Namely, there was a study done some 40 years ago in Jamaica, in a slum of Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica. And this program was very radical. I mentioned these other programs like, 2 or 3 hours a day for 5 days a week for 2 years. I also mentioned another program and the ABC, which was 8 hours a day for 5 years. Very expensive, $20,000 up to $80,000 to $100,000 US dollars per child. Very expensive programs. The Jamaican study is radical in its simplicity, but it isolated one key aspect of what these programs were doing. The Jamaican study engages the parent. It visits the home with a parent, teaching them how to interact with the child. The visit is about 1 hour a week. 1 hour. It's not a long, no big center. And the visitors are not PhDs, they're not MAs, they're not even college graduates. The visitors are people of the same level of education and skill and background as the people in the villages. Lou Mai and I and Joe Jen were working in Bijay last August, and we saw people who were of the village, people who were of the village. And so this is something that looks like it's just a non-starter. It's so low-key, very non-technical, and so forth. But this was studied randomly, and I got involved in it as a scientist. I became curious about it, and then with a group of people, including Rodrigo Pinto and the originator of the program, which is Sally Grantham McGregor, Susan Walker, and others, we found a group of children. We interviewed this data, and these children were followed up. They were 9 to 24 months old when they entered the program, and they've been followed up into the mid-30s. So we have data on these children. And the one thing that happened, we have these different streams, but the children who basically got this cognitive intervention, and what was the nature of the intervention? It was basically this teaching the parent how to interact with the child. It didn't say you must do this. It didn't tell them you're a bad parent. It just told them what you might do and what kind, and it's amazing how many parents don't realize how powerful their role can be. So when you engage the parent, you get some pretty amazing results. So look at age 30. If you look at the labor market outcomes of the Jamaican children, you can see the treatment group children are getting much higher wages. They're having much more likely to work. We can see they're much more likely to go to college. These are all disadvantaged kids living in a slum in Jamaica. When you look at things like IQ scores, those have been boosted. Remember, the genetic effect would say you can't boost these, but there isn't. It's clear their parents probably don't have as high an IQ, but these children have been given the advantage of an active, engaged parent. And if you look at measures of depression and you look at measures of conscientiousness and so forth, you do find some strong effects. And there's a similar program, a more recent program that's been developed in Ireland by Orla Doyle, a person working with us on this project. And this is this is something that occurs every 1 hour, once every 2 weeks, the fortnight in British terms. And again, the people who visited with the home visitors were people of the role of the village, of the people they were visiting. And so what we find is substantial benefit. And so if you look at this, you find that kids at ages 10, 11, and 12 are now looking at, for example, much more likely, the high treatment group are much more likely to be lower hyperactivity, have higher social competence, and so forth and so on. And so what you're seeing is a big advantage, like we saw in Jamaica. The one thing that I would emphasize, though, and this goes back to the eugenic argument, what we can do is look at the IQ of children and parents when they enter the program, and then what the correlation is, say, at age 9. So it's just early on still, early days. And if you look at the correlation in the treatment group, low treatment group, the one on top, the correlation is 0.31 at age 4, and it's 0.57 at age 9. If you look at the treatment group children, the bottom set of correlations, you can see that literally, even after they've entered the program at age 9 to 24 months, so they're very early on, by age 4, already the correlation is much, much weaker. And what you can see then is, but that the correlation has shrunk to a very low level compared to those of the control group. And so what you get then is the intergenerational transmission of IQ is diminished. You've enhanced. So the accident of birth is playing a much less decisive role. Okay, so now I conclude with this project that Lou Mai will talk about, I hope, today as well. And this is with Zhou Zhen and Lu Bai. This program was patterned after China Reach, but it was widened to a much greater scale. It was tailored after a group of people, targeted to a group of disadvantaged people in Gansu, in western China, a very poor area. And it was patterned after Jamaica Reach, but adapted, culturally adapted to the culture in Gansu. But again, it's 1 hour a week for 36 months, and we follow these children. And what you can see is strong effects. Now, these are only early results. We hope to have longer-term results, right? We will hopefully analyze these shortly. But we have treatment effects on skills, social and emotional, fine motor, language and cognitive skills. And what we also find is that China Reach is on target to replicate those Jamaican results that I had before. It's not the same, but nonetheless, so we know that Jamaica was successful. It had a cost-benefit analysis of we think it's 7 or 8 to 1, still being checked. But China Reach and Jamaica Reach are equal, seem to be on the same track, which means then it'll be a successful program. So here's an example in the early years of how these two different programs are producing skill development. And so they're very similar. But the interesting thing is the cost is about 5% of these more expensive programs. And this is a little bit like saying what you do is you isolate. I have this kind of self-serving analogy about Madame Curie and radium. Remember the story about pitchblende? I don't know if you ever, how we got into the modern age of atomic energy, but this guy, Becquerel, I think, in Paris, left a photographic plate in his office over the weekend, and it came back with all this contamination on the plate, and nobody could understand where it came from. And Madame Curie and her husband carefully took the pitchblende, which was the material they left on the plate, and resolved it into radium, which was the central ingredient of the radioactivity in that material. I would argue we have something similar going on here, in the sense that we're resolving the effectiveness of what the thing that's causing, not a photographic plate, but the effective aspect of these programs to encouraging parenting. And what this is a dynamic new approach. It's not like we're just pumping money into a child. It's not like we're sending the kid to a school to somehow look at a classroom board and take notes. What we're doing is we're engaging the parent to engage with the child, to engage with the rest of the world. So it's a very different notion. You're working on parents to engage the child. You're helping the family. You're supplementing the family. But what that is bringing in private resources, namely the family, with all the love and altruism that exists there, into the life of the child. And so we can see very strong effects. So Here I have a series of tabulations. I'll just summarize them since I'm over time. And namely that if we compare the classic programs, Perry and ABC, which you see so much attention in the past, the China Reach and the PFL program at the same ages and the same measures are finding very strong, even stronger treatment effects. And the same thing is true if we look at early life cognition, very strong effects. And then as we go out, past China Reach now still hasn't made its way here, but Lu Mai will give us the data soon at age 8 and 9. And pretty soon we can put the China Reach into this slide. And what you can see is that the home visiting programs, which are very low cost, are producing roughly the same skills. That's not to say these other things that go on the program are harmful, but it is saying that we've isolated an ingredient. And if you have only one ingredient, maybe this is the most important ingredient to engage the parent. And the same thing is true for things like later life skills. We can go out and look at the engagement. But if you look now, I just mentioned China Reach is on target to do things that are like the Jamaican program. And if you look at the omnibus programs and the Jamaican programs, you can see a huge difference. Look what's going on, for example, in Jamaica. Jamaica program very comparable to Perry ABC for employment, for reducing crime, for reducing alcohol, marijuana usage, and so forth. And so this is a very interesting thing. It's isolating that one ingredient that turns out to be the secret sauce. So let me just conclude with one thing. I don't want to end this saying it must always be in early childhood. The one thing we know about human development, and this is a modern finding in the last 20 or 30 years, and again, it's something I think we've all known. Everybody knows about adolescent years, how crazy adolescents are, they do all dumb things and so forth. But there really is a second period of opportunity for intervention, and that is in the adolescent years. And that's when the prefrontal cortex is being formed. This matter of the executive functioning, self-control and the like plays a major role. And we also know that the early part of the development of childhood in adolescence, part of the development of the personality is basically that the pleasure centers, the pleasure centers of the brain develop earlier than the control centers. That explains adolescence. And so we know, too, that prefrontal cortex is developing. So there is a second opportunity. And in fact, Terry Moffat, the one who mentioned the story about the 3- and 4-year-old, talks about a second efflorescence of crime, a different pattern of criminal behavior that shows externalizing behavior opening up in the teenage years. It leads to a shorter cycle as the prefrontal cortex is developed. But it's a different target population, still an effective targeting population, and one that's under study today, but I'm not going to talk too much about it. But it is a major target of opportunity as well, and I think it's something going forward we might want to think about integrating these two. So the common principle here, and if I were to broaden this talk, I would include job training, I would include work, and not only in school, but on the factory floor and in the workplace and wherever, the home, that mentoring, parenting, mentoring of an adolescent child is a kind of parenting practice. And we know that when we have some kind of mentoring, again, very low levels of mentoring, studies that have been done in Germany and Switzerland have shown that very low levels of mentoring can seriously improve the life and opportunities available to children. So it's, again, engaging in the life of the child, a mentor, an adult. And so this is something to think about. So let me just summarize. There are many challenges, and we talked about these global challenges. I'm very glad this forum is going to address those challenges, and I hope this lecture contributes at least some suggestion towards building the skill that meet those challenges. But I hope that you can come out and like to just summarize and say, we know that we have to think more broadly about the skills that matter. And the skills that matter are engagement. So flourishing, much more. So instead of the idea that somehow it must be an IQ test, an arraignment. I mean, I had a colleague who once said that he almost never used algebra, therefore we should not teach anybody algebra. That was a truly stupid idea, but that's okay. There's a lot of stupidity in the world. But what we do want to say is we don't want to just focus on a Raven's test. It's more than just how well I can solve a puzzle. The real puzzle consists of taking the essential features of a true puzzle and making it into a problem that you can solve and understand and breaking it into its components. And so that's what executive functioning is doing, and that's an important life skill. We also know that skills are not set in stone. We're not genetic. We're 100 years away from Bertrand Russell and eugenics. We know that parenting is a successful intervention. Mentoring is a form of parenting, and it's something that we can encourage. And early life interventions that can stimulate parenting are effective, and they're low cost. And they have these multiplier effects. So we can simultaneously activate the family. Anything that activates. So it's an addition, one model is to basically rain down resources on top of the poor. Another one is to basically engage the poor, the family life, to create a rich home life. And we can see what the consequences are when it's done. So we have some effective programs, and I would thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Heckman, for your remarkable lecture. So please go to the stage to take one of the seats on the stage. Then you will be followed by the panelists for the dialogue session. So Mr. Lu Mai, may you go to the stage as well, and then Mr. Liang Chang, and then Mr. Joseph Se, and Professor Kellogg Chen. I'm also proud to invite one of our assistant professors in the Department of Economics and Finance to join the panel discussion as well. Professor Zhou Jing, she is the co-author mentioned in the China Reach project. She was the former student of Professor Heckman, and she has been working with Professor Heckman closely. So I'm very proud to present one of our junior faculty on the stage. I think we can start right away. So from your lecture, we learned how important it is to have early childhood intervention for skill development and its lifelong impact. Because we are talking about social mobility and equality, right? So could you elaborate on the type of skills that are most crucial for promoting equality and social mobility?
Well, I guess I should use this. Hello? Yeah. I mentioned already this fascination historically with IQ. Li Kuan and the whole, many people, it's important to be smart. I'm not suggesting it's good to be dumb. On the other hand, I think it's important also to be able to stay with the project, with whatever you're doing, to stay with it, to be conscientious, and then also to engage in this whole variety of other social skills. So it's a combination of persistence, resilience, and then I mentioned, which I think is a skill that's increasingly important in the modern world, which is this, what psychologists call executive functioning. It's just this capacity to engage, to be resilient, to allow yourself to fail and pick yourself up, and at the same time to be able to look at the world instead of looking at it only in an autistic way of just an abstract problem, to think very deeply about the way different parts of reality come together. And so I think this kind of executive functioning, this ability to draw inferences from the larger environment and maybe to condense them down, very important. But the social skills are as well. We know that in China. I mean, I know the Chinese have very strong guanxi, I think is very important, right? As a trait that's more valued, I think, in China than it is in the United States, at least formally. So I think there are many different social skills which we need to recognize. But part of it is also teaching people to stay on track and to guide themselves, to have a little bit of self-reflection. In fact, a lot of self-reflection. And one of the things that was been found in the past by psychologists is that if you give quick answer questions, where people can, you can tricky questions that people want to, you want to track people up on simple logical fallacies, and you give them a limited time, smart people typically make a lot of mistakes because they want to show how smart they are, and they're eager to show their. The idea of what's sometimes called cognitive reflection is extremely important. The ability to be able to look in a problem, to think things through. And those are things that can be trained. And they're not trained in the typical classroom. And the same thing is true. And this work by this French neuroscientist I referred to, I didn't refer to him by name. His name is Den Haan. He's at the Collège de France. And he's done many books now looking at neuroscience and learning. There's a book called Reading on the Brain and How We Learn and so forth. But again, this idea of these simple traits where we can see neuroscientific counterparts, where we actually see how this affects brain development and then subsequent performance, we can then see then that the ability to stay on task, to retain attention, to hold ideas in mind, to essentially then interact effectively with other people, engage them, those skills are extremely important. And they probably become even more important in the modern world. So if you're working as a peasant in a rice field and you're under heavy supervision, probably you don't need many of these skills other than the ability to stay with the task. But I think in the modern world, we increasingly demand these social and emotional skills, but our measurement systems don't yet reflect them. They're starting to. PISA really has engaged. The OECD is now a whole series of tests, starting in 2019, I think it was, 2020. They started a series of exams trying to measure social and emotional skills. It's a project underway, but even PISA, which is so resistant in this regard, is showing some sign of understanding these. So.
Thank you very much. So the next question is for Mr. Mai Lu. So in your former role in CDRF, you launched the China Reach program mentioned by Professor Heckman, right? I believe you are still actively involved in this program. So can you share more with us about the China Reach program?
Yes, I come from China, mainland, and CDRF, China Development Research Foundation, is a non-profit organization affiliated with a government think tank, Development Research Center of State Council. So our mission is advance good governance and policy to promote economic and social development in China. That means that we focus on policy issue and just like Professor Heckman said, we try to find evidence-based policy to help our government to make it. So 2005, we wrote a report with UNDP in China. That's a human development report. The subject is about development with equity. Equity issue at that time already emerged, big issue in China. So we recognize the problems, but how to solve it? After that, we try to figure it out. Earlier child development is important. We think about the education and the nutrition, these two important issues. So in 2006, we started the social experiment about the nutrition improvement in the rural area. So after our pilot project, government make the decision to expand the project to whole over the rural China. That means now 40 million of students get benefit from it, and 20 billion of RMB Chinese government expend every year. In our experiment, it's only 3 million donated by 3 companies, and 2,000 students get benefit, and 1,000 receive clothes. So that's starting the social experiment. Under 2009, we started another program focused on earlier nutrition. We distribute the 营养包 created by Professor Chen Chunming. And also we set up a preschool in the village. We call it One Village, One Preschool, which also successful. We won award from a World Education Forum 2018 for One Village, One Preschool. But 2011, we see the Harvard video about how important in the earlier years. And very fortunately, 2012, we invited Professor James Heckman to help us how to design, how to implement, how to do the intervention in the rural area for the children under 3 years old. So that's our chairman to invite him as the advisor. So we are very fortunately, he agreed, he accepted. Since then, we worked together for 12 years. I hope I can work with him for another 12 years. Yes, I retired. He is still very active, but I'm volunteers to CDRF and continue to run some project. So James held a seminar in Chicago, compare different model, Jamaica, ABC, and also others. And he think the evidence base shows Jamaica is suitable for Chinese rural area. And we decided we should do that. So we got help from Professor Sally McGurk about how to do the home visiting. We have several trainings with she and her assistant. This is a project started in Huachi. You can see James last year to visit Bijie. That's another project, other place that we run. And also Tibet. Actually, we're a little bit worried about him to go to so high place, but he did. Very successful, yeah. And very encouraging for those home visitors. The first time to see the foreigner professor to give him speech. So this is a China Reach program. I don't want to go to detail, but you can see from here the model and who do this and how to treat them to prepare and what's the curriculum. We learned that from Jamaica, but we have update. So James didn't show the result he did with Zhang Jin, but that shows 80% of the kids get the treatment, get the benefit from a program. And this is also another example in Bijie. So one township get first in 2017, and then by 2021, we started another baseline test for other township, and this is differences it shows. I show you a short video. It can explain many things.
The 2 square meters bed is the entirety of Hao Hao's world. His grandmother was cooking, and great-grandmother needed to do farm work. Hao Hao was growing up alone, and he can only grow up alone. The journey from the township to Hao Hao's home is an 11-kilometer ride through the mountains, passing by 15 bends of a winding road on yellow soil and snow-covered Huangtu Plateau. But it's not enough that no one cares about. When Hao Hao and his family first met Jiang Lingjuan, they were shy, but curious. That's when things began to change. In Huachi County, Qingyang, Gansu Province, children from 6-month-old to 36-month-old receive home visiting from China Reach. Systematic and scientific parenting intervention from China Development Research Foundation is carried in home visitors' canvas bags to remote mountains. Home visitors and supervisors here has grown from just kind strangers into a rebuilder of the whole family environment.
头发、脖子、乱皮皮还画纸线、画娃娃，叫的几次都给叫的，都回来，回来。
主要的是也让这个家人的这个视野更开拓一点，想着说原来咱们还可以这样教育孩子。说是给孩子做早期教育，其实也是我们督促家长和宝宝进行更好的互动。
Children like Hao Hao don't need to grow up alone anymore. Over 2 years, China Reach's parenting intervention has increased the proportion of normal results in developmental screening test by 51.4%. Families that received home visit compared to control group scored 4.96 higher in home environment assessment. We are willing to go to the most remote regions to devote ourselves to secure the first 1,000 day of a child's life with the warmth of family. Here, in the Shan-Gan-Ning border region, the idea of access to childcare is germinating.
The program, end of last year, is run in 10 provinces, 13 counties. The total received the home visiting, the boys and the girls, 13,000. And we have 1,000 home visitor. So it's very successful, but for each of those kids receive this intervention, need 3,000 RMB. So the question is how to raise the fund for those work. These boys, their parents separate, so only great grandma can take care of. But with one caregiver who received help from home visitor, she learned how to do with the kids and prepare and also repeat in the week. So now this boy is 9 years old in the primary school and very good in the school. He received a laugh and also now he grew up, he treated other people fairly. So in the school, he is, how do I say, some kind of good boy. 三好学生，数学课代表。How do I say? Now we need to expand this to all the rural China. We hope government can make the decision soon, but still we need to compete with other idea. For example, UNICEF now promote center-based intervention, but this center-based cannot reach the family just like these boys. They're in the mountain area, remote, and the grandma or great-grandma cannot carry these boys to the center. So we need to make the service available for all those village family. Now we decided to expand the program. We call this Bright Star for our children. Those plan, we want to expand the coverage to 100,000 kids. And we hope government can follow for 3 million kids to receive this intervention. And that means government need to spend 15 billion RMB each year. We think it's possible with budget revenue and with government goals to common prosperity. So this is our plan. And this is sort of the urban resettlement community. Now in China, in the poverty area, they close to the county and the township. And also we started the project in Hangzhou. That's center-based, but plus the home visiting. The differences compared with the city and the rural, it's one big difference is in the rural, the trust between the neighbor is already there. So not the stranger come to the family, but the friends or even relatives to come to help them. So, but in urban, to make those trust, you need some kind of the professional and need some sort of a certification. So that's different. I hope Hong Kong can also have this kind of the project. Yeah, you already have. Oh, great. So I just ended here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very impressive. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lu, for sharing the information and the data about the China Reach program with us. So let me go back to Professor Heckman for one more question. As mentioned by Mr. Lu, it seems like this China Reach program will be implemented in China on a large scale. Then what will be the impact on the equality and the social mobility in China if this program is really, implemented all over China in both the rural and urban areas?
Let me just add one thing about these programs that Lu was describing. It's easy at some level to sort of think all these programs are kind of alike. They're all targeting early childhood and so forth. But the strategies that are being developed are very different. And I would be very careful in saying that, we have this. So, for example, even though we think of this program in Jamaica and now in China, in Chicago, which is a fairly advanced city, we're actually implementing for the first time this program, this Jamaican, this China Reach program, into a neighborhood that's called Back of the Yards. It's a neighborhood program that's been around for many, many years, since the stockyards were flourishing in Chicago. But it still represents something new. And I think the principles, I would be very careful about applying those principles and recognizing. Just because, in fact, this is one of the problems with early childhood, the whole activity in the world, around the world, and that is that there are many people using the words and focusing on the same time zone, the same age range, I'm sorry, but not really doing the same thing and not focusing on the essence. So there are people who are anxious and increasing the income of the family and saying that's the way to promote child development, or to have a particular center, or to do it this way or that. I think there's something quite unique and very valuable in targeting and engaging the parent in this way. And so in that sense, I would look for programs that have that. But to answer your question, though, I would also add that I think the effect on China will be substantial. I mean, the left behind children in China is a huge area, a huge problem, a lot of children. You know, China has great potential, huge potential, still has great potential, especially to bring the rural area up to the level of development of the urban area. And these programs will give that. And there's a huge talent pool out there in the West. It's being discovered. It's getting integrated into society. I'm not trying to criticize Chinese society or policy, but I'm thinking it could move ahead. And these programs will do that. And it'll give opportunity. And I think in that sense, it'll add to the existing set of programs that are in place. And I would just urge everybody, maybe Lumai would agree or disagree, but there are all these competing approaches, and it's fine. It should be competition. There should be lots of diverse thinking. But when we see something that works effectively and we get to the essence, and then we think about the intuition of engaging the family and the mother or the caregiver, and in a way that is very family-friendly and environment-friendly, I think we want to think very hard and long about fostering that particular approach, thinking strongly about how that can be used. And I see it as having a huge possibility, just because there are so many children. Left behind children, I have another study which I'm doing here, not going to talk much about it, but in an Mianzhu study where we have a group of children, several thousand children in Mianzhu, and some of them are left behind children. And you can see that when the parents are left behind, leaving the children behind, they send remittances. You can see the remittance. Parents are sending money. The family has more money. But we can see that the trade-off is not a very good one between the parents actively engaged in the life of the child and the money that's replacing the parent. The money doesn't do half as good a job. It's it's just not replacing the parent, the absent parent. And these programs can do that. It can essentially encourage it. And even as you saw in this video, which was amazing, you saw this grandmother was very, very much, probably 3 years of school, very less educated, from a much older generation. Nonetheless, she was teaching essentially simple geometry and simple line, essentially engaging the child. And so what you're doing is you're activating her into the life of the family in a way, maybe giving her even a richer life, but in addition to providing the child. So it's this kind of, I like the idea of energizing the available resources, which is a different model than coming down and raining resources down on the child and the family. And I think it's that engagement and the fact that you're building parenting, you're building a skill for the family, which many of the other approaches don't do. It's really very important. So I think it'll have a huge promise, because I think the left behind children, we know they're important, we know that we can do something, and that this program, I think, is one avenue for doing that. And left behind children are not just in rural areas, they're in many urban areas too, where people migrate to the West. So,
thank you very much. So there are two questions for Mr. Joseph Shi. The first question is that from your unique perspective as a lawyer turned fintech entrepreneur, what types of skills do you think are crucial in fostering equality and social mobility? Second, we've learned that your company, XYD Financial Services Holdings Limited, embodies the United Nations concept of inclusive financing, aiming to provide equal access to financial services for smaller enterprises using AI and big data. So can you share with us your approach, how it can be integrated into educational programs to enhance skills and promote social mobility?
Wow, very big questions. Okay, I'll try to answer them. Perhaps, I'll start with a brief introduction of myself. As explained by Professor Wong, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm very much a local boy, or not a boy now, but I was born in Hong Kong, educated in Hong Kong all the way through university. And then I had the opportunity, very fortunately, of studying my master's degree in London. And then subsequently, I joined an international law firm and have since been an international finance lawyer until 2015, when I retired from my old firm, which is one of the leading international law firms. And then I founded my current company, which is a fintech group with its operations mainly in China. Although we have some senior executives based in Hong Kong, including myself, but 400 employees in our group are very much based in China. So to answer the question, first of all, I very much echo what Professor Heckman has been sharing with us this morning about the importance of socio-emotional skills. As an employer, both in a law firm or in my current fintech company, IQ will obviously get you into the door, is your entry ticket. But to carry you further in your career, only IQ is not sufficient. It's probably a necessary but not sufficient condition for success in life. So, we employers always, look at, say, promotions, for example, right? Who should be promoted to be a leader or a manager and so on. And, apart from their technical skills, we often look for their soft skills, what we call soft skills. Basically, these are socio-emotional skills. And you may wonder what those skills are. It's hard to define. I'd like to find a definition, but there are various descriptions of those skills, some of which have already been covered in Professor Heckman's presentation. And but another very important skill, apart from socio-emotional skills, at least in the context of, say, for example, my former employer, which is a leading international law firm. I would also add that cross-cultural skills are extremely important. In a way, when I talk about cross-cultural skills, it's not just about language skills. It's not just about knowing a little bit of history about other countries and so on. It's really knowing the cultures of the people. And when I talk about cultures, it's not necessarily just defined by reference to countries. China is a big country. We have different cultures just within China, our own country. And being able to understand the differences in cultures of people coming from different backgrounds, different regions, is an essential part of success in workplace. And even in China, for example, we have people from different countries. We have people from different parts of China, and very often, just very simply, you just organized a lunch or dinner amongst colleagues, and they eat different types of food, right? They have different preferences. One of my companies is based in Chongqing, and every dish they order would be spicy.
So for people coming from Guangdong like myself, well, I'm okay with spicy food, but some of my Guangdong colleagues, would find it, hard to cope with every single dish being very spicy. So even things like that, you can imagine, if you are sort of, trying to organize a meal for your clients, right, coming from different parts of the countries, you have to be slightly sensitive to this sort of little things in life. And, but the question is, how do we actually teach or promote or nurture these cross-cultural skills? Okay, there is, the kind of hard knowledge part, like, language, a little bit of history helps, but there is nothing to substitute for experiencing, the different cultures yourself. And so it takes a little bit of, opportunities for you to do that. Well, in this age of internet and technologies, this helps, right? TikTok or Douyin and Xiaohongshu and all these other social apps do help in exposing us to different ways of life throughout the world. And, but there is no substitute for actually experiencing, different cultures, different food, different ways of life yourself by either spending a little bit of time abroad, either through studying or working, or even, spending a holiday in different parts of the world. And, but we all know that, this requires a little bit of financial resources. Say at university level, and, I like to say, well, I'm a council member as well, so I'm duty bound to promote our university a little bit. We are the most international university by rankings, right? That's a fact. The most international university in the world. And we should take full advantage of this, right? Having all these great faculties and students from all over the world, all converging in at CityU. And this is already a golden opportunity for all students and faculty alike, for us to expose ourselves to different cultures. And by just engaging, I've been hearing this word a lot, this morning, by engaging with others within the university. And we also provide, student exchange programs to our students. Again, that's a fantastic way of giving them the opportunities to see the real world, to know, some real friends as opposed to just some internet, fans. We're talking about real friends, by giving them the exposure to spend a little bit of time abroad, to hopefully know some friends, hopefully these relationships will last, for their lifetime. And that will, I'm sure, change their perspectives in life a lot. I, for one, have the benefit of experiencing different cultures, both in my studies, in my work as well. Now, I'll give you, one example. We used to give training to our younger lawyers on how to deal with clients from different countries, different cultures. And say, for example, on how to deal with Japanese clients, for example. We would say, don't take their yeses on their face value. Because, at every meeting, when you're negotiating with your Japanese counterparts, they say, yes, yes, yes. Do you agree with this? Yes. But their yes is actually just, if you like, an acknowledgement of what you say. Or, in English, that simply means noted. Or, some English people would say, all right. But that doesn't mean that is right or yes. It simply means that I hear you. So again, that's, if you just take the yes on its face value, you would assume that it has agreed to all the points that you have raised. But then only afterwards, when they came back with a whole raft of comments, basically disagreeing with what you have said at the meeting, then you realize that they haven't actually agreed to anything. So that's just one simple example of illustrating the importance of reading between the lines, in a way, it is a higher level of socio-emotional skills, but at cross-cultural or cross-country level. So I'll just, pause here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Heckman, do you have a good definition of social emotional skills for Mr. Joseph Xie?
Articulated one of them, which is the interpretation of meaning and intentionality. I mean, these are skills that are somehow developed. We develop them ourselves through experience, but these are skills that also can be pointed out. I mean, for example, in the Chinese context, you just gave an example of kind of a warning signal to your Chinese counterparts dealing with Japanese businessmen. But I think there's a sense in which developing this kind of sensitivity is partly can be developed by pointing out some subtleties which may not be immediately apparent to people in a given culture. So I agree with you, the intercultural transmission, it can be very, very, I wouldn't say difficult, but requires some challenges. So in terms of these social skills, I mean, I put up a big list, and I realize it's very vague in a way that I can go through a list of things like risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, positive and negative reciprocity, the ways we deal with the response. Do we find tit for tat? If somebody offends us, do we offend back? Or do we respond in a more... Part of these are matters that are taught through sometimes lessons of morality or lessons of character training, but also people can be aware of certain types of skills that are very, very important. I mentioned guanxi. I've been doing some work in China looking at measurement of personality. And there's some very rich work being done here in Hong Kong by Chinese scholars looking at different aspects of personality which arise from the culture and the way that individuals react to each other. And so I think there is a context specificity there which is useful to understand. And that can be codified, that can be studied. But the kind of skill I was talking about earlier is that a skill, the trouble is that psychologists don't even like to use the word skill. Psychologists frequently use the word trait. And partly the reason why they like trait is they're back in a genetic world where somehow this is frozen. I think skill is the right way because we always are evolving. But there are a series of situations that we shape the way that we respond. And I think what's important here is, in terms of developing this full range, is to understand maybe context sensitivity. It'd be a one way to think about it. And so when I was talking about executive functioning, I meant more than just kind of, the ability to stay on a task, but also the ability to kind of become aware of a situation. It's awareness. It's very interesting. That's something that's not easily taught in some ways, but it can be. But it requires a certain kind of sensitivity and the capacity to listen to others. But I think that can be encouraged. It can be taught. Parents teach it, and especially if parents embody it. But teachers can as well. But there are a whole variety of these skills that are extremely important. The real question, and I'm actively engaged in a project on this, a different project, but with a group of psychologists and economists, is asking, how many different ways are we different? I mean, personality psychology is a whole field that was started off like about 100 years ago when IQ was being formed. And the way that personality was originally developed by the first psychologists is they went to a Webster's dictionary of the English language, and they put down all the possible ways that people can be different from each other. So there are thousands of different ways. Not a very useful analytical framework. And so then the psychologists went to a much simpler scheme, so-called Big Five. It's based on factor analysis, not really based on anything other than factor analysis, but it turned out to be moderately predictive. We're still in the process of developing exactly all of the life-relevant skills. And as AI comes in. And as we think more about even interacting with chatbots and so forth, there are certain kinds of skill that will emerge as being very important to survive in those environments that were completely irrelevant when that technology wasn't there. So I would just approach this with a sense of trying to develop some sensitivity to what the issues are, what the situation is, and then how we can best understand it, and then take from that the traits that are productive or the skills that are productive. But it's an ongoing thing. I think new skills will emerge. They have emerged. Think about the internet. I mean, we have a whole new personality almost about dealing with internet. We have a whole new culture about social media. And it's not just that, I mean, we're still people. We still have some of the same basic values. But the way we engage the social media and the way we engage each other is evolving. And we should understand that and teach. I think that's where I think in the end, the ultimate skill is the ability to learn new skills, the ability to adapt. That's what I was trying to get at with executive functioning. It's just saying, okay, to be aware of what's needed and then go the next step further. That's very vague, though. I can give you long lists. But now in this project, I mean, I'm literally doing this project in this Mianzhu data we talked before. We're looking at things that economists ordinarily look at, things like time preference, risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, various aspects that are very traditional for economic analysis. And we're comparing those and finding out how those are related to more standard psychological measurements. And there are some related. There is overlap. But there isn't perfect overlap. And there are different dimensions of human differences that we're beginning to fully explore. And so even when it comes to things like, I would say reciprocity, positive and negative, and morality and altruism and future-orientedness, that we're beginning to understand subtler ways to engage those things. And so that's why I'm very reluctant to say here's the big 5 or the big 20 or big whatever. But I do think that's the skill we want, right? To learn how to learn. And to learn, that means being sensitive, which is different from just knowing a fact. I can learn a fact and stick to it and pound the table all day. But I can also then say, oh, wait, this is new. And that's the ultimate skill, the ability to respond to something new and respond in a way that doesn't threaten you so much as just informs you, and then you develop this kind of, I would call it a kind of cognitive reflection. So anyway, too long.
Thank you. Yeah, so the next question is for Mr. Liang Zhang. You had a role with Hong Kong Jerky Club, right, as the executive director of charities and community. Now you are with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. So how has your experience with these two organizations informed your views on policy making related to education, training, skill development for disadvantaged population in Hong Kong?
Right, thank you. I'll probably refer to mostly my previous experience in philanthropy for this particular question. I do have a couple of examples. Let's see how time goes. I may just share one. But one of them is a project that we initiated and carry on because Lu Laosi just asked me, if Hong Kong has similar program in early childhood development. So this program is called Key Step. The program we launched in 2017 based on a couple of observations, if you will. Now, Hong Kong, we all know we had a fairly low birth rate. So for the longest time, we had about 55,000 babies a year, anywhere between 48 to 55. But the last couple of years, it dropped to like 35 because of COVID, and generally people just don't want to, have babies anymore. So from that sense, every baby is very, very critical as a human talent for the society. So that's one. Now, the other set of data or observation is really how the neuroscience has evolved to inform us that, a lot of the brain development actually happened before the age of 6. And then, also 3 years old's brain activity or stimulation is actually, almost 2 times as an adult, and etc. But then when it comes to the society, when you observe different groups, which I think resonate a lot with Professor Heckman, what you just shared, a lot of the families who have resources, they also have the skill set and knowledge of how to bring up, the kids. But the underprivileged families, the less resourceful families, they are faced not just with a shortage of resources, but a shortage of knowledge. Right? How do you approach that even? Right? It's not like you just force vocabularies onto the kids. That's not the right way, actually. And we all know early childhood, the most important thing is nutrition, is sleeping well, having enough time to sleep, is exercising, is the right kind of stimulation, right? So anyway, 2017, we launched this program with 3 academic institutions, including the City University of Hong Kong, and 4 NGOs together. So we initially started with 2 districts in Hong Kong, and then 32 kindergartens. So basically, it's a whole range of intervention, including basically everything you guys have mentioned, because we took a lot of benchmark and reference from the global studies. So home visits, center-based approach, grandparents and parents education, teachers education. We also went so far as to look into the 32 kindergartens and look at their physical environment, how they can rearrange themselves better, because given just the limitation of space in Hong Kong. So we actually hired an architect who helped us, went into these 32 schools and try to rearrange things and redesign things so that it can provide a better environment for effective delivery. So the program we ran as a pilot on that basis for a few years. We also have Professor Heckman as one of our advisors, international advisors. So now it evolved into the second phase of the program after 4 years. So back in 2022, we started into the second phase, because in the first phase, we found it extremely successful. So 100% of the students show improvement versus control. 98% of the parents felt very, very satisfied and empowered. And also 98% of the school environment have a significant improvement. So in second phase, we expand the program from 2 districts into 5 districts now, the hub base particularly. And then we also expanded the school number from 32 kindergartens to 280 kindergartens. So now covering about, close to or maybe even more than 1/3, of the student population in kindergarten in Hong Kong. So we also have a very close dialogue with the Hong Kong government, the Education Bureau. They are very, very supportive of the program. So we're now in the process of thinking how we can mainstream that, even using policy. So I think that's sort of one example on early childhood development in Hong Kong. So do I still have time to share one more example or no?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, the other program I'd like to share also started back in 2016, so 1 year before Key Step. So that one is slightly later stage. This one is in primary schools. Right? So basically, the premise was we were thinking, education and technology, they should help human being. They should help us eliminate divide. But again, in reality, when you look at education and technology, many times you see technology serve very small number of people to get rich very quickly. And education, again, sometimes also bias towards more resourceful families. Now in schools, you ask the kids to have one musical training, one sports. My son learned violin, and I know how expensive it has been. So again, we were thinking along that line and believe that digital and technology will be an important aspect of human life. But then given the resources required, so how do we help the underprivileged to at least, not already lag behind at the very beginning? So CoolThink was created at that time, also, again, with a number of universities helping. So MIT, City University of Hong Kong, and also Education University of Hong Kong. Long story short, we have created a curriculum basically to help improve or train students' computational thinking. So computational thinking is a very fancy word in this digital era, but basically it is problem solving. So exactly like what Professor Heckman has shared, It is about breaking a big problem into smaller problems. It is about iterations. It is about embracing failures. It is about getting around it, getting over it. It is about communication, sharing. And it is also about, how you deploy technology to help enhance social good. So we encourage the students to do that. Some of them come up with programmings to, let's say, help elderly people have a better access to the resources around the community, and etc. So this program, since 2016, has run now for 7-8 years. Again, long story short, we have put in 500 million Hong Kong dollar. We have trained over 10,000 students. Now it's in about 400 of the 500 primary schools in Hong Kong, so practically 80% in school already. And end of last year, actually, the Education Bureau has agreed that they will take this curriculum and the overall pedagogy into all the 500 primary schools in Hong Kong. So now it becomes a mainstream, after we tested it in 2 phases through 7-8 years. So now it becomes a mainstream curriculum in Hong Kong. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your sharing. So last but not least, Professor Caleb Chen. Actually, your question is related to what Mr. Liang Chong mentioned it last. So as the Dean of the College of Business, how do you think business education can adopt advanced technology to develop skills for improving equality and social mobility?
Okay, thank you again for inviting me to join this panel. Again, it's a fascinating talk and sharing from Professor Heckman, and also, this is a great program for China Rich. And of course, that in the university, right, we are talking about the skills that Professor Heckman talked about are really more acquired before the college, and of course, that here in the university, the skills that we are talking about are really the skills that we want the students to acquire in the college and also after they graduate. And so one thing I do want to really point out is that nowadays, in the university, we're really emphasizing more and more than the old days, more broad-based skills, whether it's a knowledge or whether these are the social and also that the mental skills. These are more broad-based, and I think that these are really what the Professor Heckman say. These are the executive functioning. I think that is about the ability to cope and adapt. To really the problems, and then to develop resilience. And of course, that the other thing is, I also want to emphasize that now we are also talking about lifelong learning. So therefore, that we don't really end the education, but just by graduating, but in fact that it is really after getting university, at least that gives you the basic, and then you really want to learn more. I think that given that this is the world, and the economy is changing so rapidly, I think it's very, very important for us, right, to have this kind of the lifelong education mindset. Now, going to this about the use of the technology for education, and I think that this is becoming more important, and also I think it's more available. Because of the development of the technology, and so now this digital learning is so advanced, right? Compared with 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was that this is really something already have talked about the online learning, and that so it is really giving the participants the access to the courses, to the programs, and not really at school, but rather that they can really do it outside the school, and also that they can really learn it at any time, right? At any place. And so it's really providing a lot of the convenience for the participants. And of course, that I have to say that this online education, online degrees, are not really that popular in Asia as compared with let's say, in the US. I think that this is because that while people might have some kind of a negative stigma, and also that they might not really be as well recognized. For example, in China, they don't really recognize the online courses, online degree, and therefore that is a real issue. So therefore, but on the other hand, I think that this online studies or this digital learning can really help to supplement our formal curriculum very much, because that nowadays with the development technology, or let's say the AI, right, is allowing us to really create a lot of this personalized, developed learning experience, because that is really based on that the characteristics or that the pace the participants would like to have, and therefore it can really give them really that the more customized experience, and also that if we are not thinking about necessarily that these are really part of the formal curriculum, and then it's really helping our students a lot. For example, I heard about like that we have one department within the business school. We have been subscribing to a software which is developed by our alumni, and that software is really helping our students to improve their communication skills. Nowadays, we all know that the communication skills, the presentation skills are so important, and of course that given that the constraint in the classroom, and also that our curriculum, right, there's really a limit to how much that we can really impose. But if we have that software, then the students are able to really use the software to help them how to develop and also to guide them. I mean, because that software is really pointing out what they're doing well and what they are not doing well. And then they have to reach a certain kind of criteria before that they really say that, call it passing the course. So therefore, in that case, that this is really supplementing what we are not able really to do as much in the classroom. And so I think that really just one example. There are a lot of this, the EdTech development, a lot of this digital learning devices, and I think that we can really bring it into really our classroom and then really help a lot more students, and therefore, this is, I think that this is very important for our business education. Maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kellogg Chen. So the discussions have been very fruitful, but due to time limit, we now have to open the floor for questions to get a feedback from the audience. So if you have any question for any of the panelists, please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, Professor Lee.
Professor Heckman, your talk is really very interesting. For some of the results you show us, the effectiveness seem to be depend on gender.
Yes.
Is there any particular reason, or is this dependency also related to culture or country?
The gender question is fascinating. I didn't emphasize that here, but they are results. Even in the China REACH study, there are results by gender. We know that when you look at the development of human beings all around the world, whether it's in China or US or Africa or wherever, that girls are generally developing more rapidly than boys in many different skills. You can see that in terms of reading, in terms of social skills. All kinds of behavioral problems are more likely associated with boys than with girls, and so forth. So there is a different maturation process that's going on, a different development process. We know also, and this is something that's controversial, and I don't want to get into feminist controversies, but there really are fundamental differences in development even of the processes of learning. I mean, girls are learning to read more rapidly, and they're acquiring skills. This has actually led, in some places in the United States anyway, for separate schools for boys and for girls. You go back in the 19th century and early 20th century, some of the old elementary schools in Chicago, there's a boys' entrance and there's a girls' entrance. And they recognized that the boys were acting differently and were maybe slower in generally in development and so forth and so on. And so over the whole life cycle, I mean, there's a push, I know. Equality is mentioned in the title here, and I don't want to oppose equality, but I'd say equality of opportunity. But there are some very fundamental learning and behavioral differences between the two groups. And they go over the whole lifetime, but certainly in the early years. And so I think it is important. When we look at some of the benefits of crime, for example, when I was talking about Perry, girls simply don't commit crime. Women, in many societies, it doesn't matter. And whether that's social or biological, there's a primatologist, I guess I'd call him that, at Stanford named Sapolsky, who actually wrote a book called The Trouble with Testosterone. But again, there's kind of hormonal basis. We do know that certain behavioral differences appear at the emergence of puberty, for example, in the adolescent years, which I didn't talk much about. But even at the very earliest years, girls are developing at a different rate. And I think that's important in really understanding and in providing this kind of individual specific training. And whether or not it's cultural is a deep issue. But some of these differences that emerge at a very, very early age, we're talking about the first few months. And, you know, the claim is that girl babies are much more likely to smile and respond to a caregiver than a boy. I mean, why that's true, I don't know, but I don't know how that, and this is a baby. This is not somebody who's been out in the world and has gone to college and has acquired a skill. This is literally something that seems to be very intrinsic. And that we do know that when mothers are pregnant, they provide much more likely these oxytocin, which builds bonding, and the bonding relationship between the mother and the child is generally stronger than that between the father and the child. The father produces oxytocin too, but at a diminished level compared to the woman. And so there are a whole series of biological differences which give rise to parenting practices being different, but also just of the process of development. And I think we need to report that. I mean, just look at physical development. You know, boys generally are bigger. Girls are generally more nimble. I mean, literally as they develop. This isn't universal. There's a distribution here. So there isn't like all girls are the same or all boys are the same. But there certainly are major gender differences if you just look at means. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, there's certainly many men who are ballet dancers and are very flexible and so forth. So I'm not claiming nimble. But again, there's just a huge number of these. And this is getting way off topic, but I am a little concerned sometimes about the fact that people want to mandate an equality that isn't there. And we might go back and think, well, look, if boys are are developing at a different rate, then the boys may fall behind the girls. We have a curriculum that's really targeted towards the girls. The boys may not be able to progress as well as the girls because they're acquiring later skills and they're developing. I don't know that. That process is very much under investigation. So I don't want to pretend that it's known or that I'm sure there are others in this room who know more than I. But I do think that it's very important. And you see this throughout all of these differences. And whether it's cultural, I don't know. But people claim that at puberty, you see some there's a psychologist at Drexel University named Steinberg, and he's written a lot on adolescence. And he sees major differences, which we know observe empirically, between boys and girls on the arrival of puberty. And some of those are social differences, and some of them are also differences in terms of the degree of intensity of expression and the ability to think of taking risks, extreme risks, so much more. If you look at preferences that we elicit, risk preferences for girls are generally more risk averse. However, and this is one thing that one of my colleagues has found, and it gets to your point, and that is that in certain matrilineal societies where women are more likely to be in charge, then you're actually finding that the men are more risk averse than the women. So when women are put in that kind of leadership, so some of these can be acquired. But the exact boundary, I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish somebody else, if they knew more, I'd be happy to listen rather than talk.
But in short, shall we say that actually we should intervene even earlier for girl than boy?
Well, you could also say, leave them alone. They're going to develop pretty well on their own. No, I'm not saying that either. But I think we should recognize that, yes, that there are certain, but you see, when we talk about intervention, we have to be very careful. You see, if I thought about early childhood as a place when I'm teaching people how to read Chinese, or for example, or read English or German or whatever, that's not the right way to think about it. What you're trying to do is engage the child in learning, and it doesn't mean a specific type of learning. And see, that's one big lesson. Lu Mai and I were together in Beijing a few months ago at a meeting, and we wanted to basically, one of the very intelligent authorities there in working in education and psychology really wanted to make a difference, as I completely agree with it, between learning and teaching knowledge for formal education. So it's not like there's a course that we're sending the girl to read and there's a course where she's turning to solve math problems. What we're doing is we're activating the brain, and then there's a whole set of skills that emerge from that parent-child interaction. And it shows up in the neurons in different ways when they're exposed to the environment, but it's building a receptivity. And whether that process operates differently in boys and girls, I don't know. All I know is that it operates earlier. It seems that the girls are learning more rapidly and that they're better behaved and they tend to be more, and I don't know why the socialization of a 2-month-old baby should be all that different, but it is. It seems to be. And so we see a lot of differences that emerge. And I personally am somewhat appalled by groups of people who want to deny any of those differences. But you're right, that's possibly one strategy. We might think of a more flexible way. And we do in some later years in education. But I don't know about early childhood. Do you separate the boys from the girls when you're?
Your assessment, the boys get the benefit more than girls
Right.
in Huachi. So we all suffer from one problem. When we want to hire the people, the girls always get the higher score in term, no matter of a writing or oral test. So we have to lower the score for boys to give them the chance.
This is a very important lesson here. And this is something that I've worked on, and I've worked on also with Angela Duckworth, who's at Penn. She's a psychologist who's done a lot of good work. But one thing that was found a long time ago, there was a sense there was discrimination against girls. And in the sense that girls had better achievement test scores, but weren't doing as well in some other scores. And then the idea was that meant that girls were smarter. This is in making the PISA test. But then we found out what causes a successful achievement test score. It's somebody who's more perseverant, somebody who's more curious, more receptive to knowledge, somebody who's willing to sit still. And those are traits that are more present among young girls than among young boys. We see that a lot of the behavioral difficulties that we see in elementary school and even preschools are more concentrated among boys than among girls, which means then they're learning at a different rate. And which even if they're the same IQ, whatever that means at age 3, that they're acquiring knowledge because the girls are willing to sit there and learn and absorb, and the boys are running around and so forth. And so that creates a difference they're better at some level because they're more engaged and more curious and actually more likely. So girls are much more likely to do homework than boys, for example. And there's a lot of behavioral difficulties that occur, and they directly affect learning. And they do affect the willingness to listen and from other groups. And so that might mean down the road, this is getting us way off field, but it does mean maybe we want to think about targeting learning in a way that really understands those behavioral difficulties and behavioral challenges, let's put it that way, and tailors the program in a way that engages the boys in a different way maybe than the girls, and recognizes they have harder time staying on task and doing things. So that's a challenge. So I would recognize the differences. Denying that, I don't think denying it, I think, sounds like a move for equality, but I think it's a move towards sticking your head in the sand and avoiding some opportunities that we could have, so. But you had some, well.
Okay, so let's have more questions from the lady here.
Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. I learned so much, and I'm here today representing a foundation, which is a small foundation, still a startup level, but it's called Belt and Road Cultural Exchange Foundation for Women. So we want to promote education for women.
Oh, for women.
Yes, we want to promote gender equality and education opportunity for women along the Belt Road countries. So far we've been working with Islamic countries, African countries, and also like countries like Mongolia have totally different lifestyle, like a nomadic lifestyle. So it's very inspiring to have you here today talking about early stage child development. And because when we look at all of the different cultural background, no matter in terms of lifestyle or religion or race, early childhood pretty much is the same. Like we're talking about brain development, we're talking about IQ and the emotional development and the interaction between parental and the children, parents and the children. So this is a fantastic project, especially to see Mr. Liu Mai, what you have been doing in China. So everything is fantastic, but
he's also working with the nomadic people in the northern part of Xinjiang, right? The Turkic people.
I have tons of questions, but out of all of these questions, I have one critical one. It's about aging population. So, for example, in China, like what the video show, most of the caregiver for the left behind children are grandparents, and especially female, like grandmothers or great-grandmothers. Definitely data shows the longevity of female is longer than male in this part of the world, in Asia in particular. So my question is that fair to these senior women? I mean, they've been working so hard throughout their life, and then at the end of their years, they became caregiver and major caregiver to these great-grandchildren. Would that be too much for them? I'm trying to picture to adopt this model to other countries, but that's my first concern.
Well, I mean, to me, it's a real opportunity in the sense that we now have societies where people are living longer. And a lot of these older people, we saw in the movie, for example, not so well educated, but they can learn how to interact with children. You showed that. In fact, the grandmother was very, very active and was showing circles and building geometric shapes and so forth. Maybe she learned those herself from the study, I don't know. But that is one very interesting way to think about social policy with an aging population, and also a notion of child development being very important, is to engage the older people in that sense in stimulating and teaching the younger children. So I think instead of you're viewing it as a problem for the older women, but maybe an opportunity in some sense, and it gives them a good, well-defined task where they can contribute. And it's a very human task too, because you're dealing with another human being. You're getting, the give and take, the empathy, the love, the exchange. So maybe I'm thinking of it differently. Maybe they've had a hard life, and I'm not denying that. But I'm thinking also they can provide themselves and the children opportunities which they might ordinarily not have. One of the difficulties I know that we see in the older population of the U.S. is isolation, that many of the older children, many of the elderly people are kept away. And that leads then to various kinds of mental problems and social problems. But now you can break that isolation by bringing them into this kind of activity. So I guess I have a different perspective, but Joe Jen has.
This program is not sort of forced, like, in the program, still 70% of main caregiver is children's mother. It's not like a grandmother or great-grandmother. Like around 30% will be grandmother because of, the both parents maybe migrate to work in the nearby city. But that's why we also extend this program to urban areas, because we want to see whether we can target the migrated, couples, and then we'll encourage them to bring their kid with them. So, and that will be like the intervention we will implement maybe late of this year in Hangzhou, and if it's successful, we may also expand it. So we try to target, some kind of low economic status, household or peoples in urban cities, and that may be also solve some kind of your concerns. And the other thing that is, we do want to see whether increase the engagements with, for example, fathers, will also that is actually a very interesting discussion. With Professor Heckman, we talk about fertility issues because in Asian countries, especially East Asian country, we have low fertility issues. But maybe it's because of the husband would like to engage more time with the wife. So in some European countries, they do find the household with larger engagement for the husband, and the fertility rate is slightly higher. So we also want to check, whether that will be true in China or in East Asian countries. And if so, probably we may provide more education or policy to support that directions. Yeah, it's not really try to force senior people to work. Yeah, yes. In our program. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may add just one dimension. No, I think if you force anyone to work at any time, whatever age, that's obviously not fair. But from aging population, some of the biggest challenges is loneliness. It is also losing the sense of purpose in life. So what you see in different countries, also even NGOs, they actually put together programs for elder people to interact with the little kids. So I know some countries, what they actually now do is they build elderly homes around kindergartens. Yes. So make it almost like a routine visit programs. So the older people can interact with the children, the young children, and it actually fits both sides in that sense.
Okay, so I think we can invite one last question from the audience. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the speech and the panel discussions. My question is probably for Professor Heckman and Mr. Lu, if time allowed. So I'm wondering, what's the merit of home visit rather than online learning? Because as we know, through the visiting programs, those parents, they have very fruitful, very worthy outcomes by accepting the home visit. Then I'm wondering, so at least in China, the disadvantaged families, those parents have internet access and smartphone something. So would it be cost saving and even although less potent, but could it be still effective if we just send them some design courses on parenting? Yes, I'm wondering, could we do that?
Well, I can't speak for my partner here, but I can say my experience has been that the kind of online instruction, the impersonal instruction, misses this element of interaction, which I keep emphasizing. We tend to minimize that. This is one big controversy. I mean, I'm a big fan of the web. I've learned a tremendous amount. We have so many lectures, and so if I want to learn something new, some new technique, some new ideas, there are many good lectures posted online, and you can learn from them. But what you don't get is the feedback. You don't get the kind of give and take. And I think that give and take is really very important. And especially, I would think, in the case of early training the child, So like the pictures you saw in Tibet, when we went there in Tibet, or Bijay, when you actually see the caretaker, the home visitor interacting with the caretaker, there's a lot of lessons. There's a lot of implicit knowledge that's traded back and forth. You know, the smiles, the gestures of the hands, the different, and those get lost on inline. So it's very hard. Maybe we can develop it. I think maybe when a good chat GPT is developed, maybe you finally get a good, we might be able to get that kind of feedback. And then we could. I think that's a possibility that we could get. But you want to be able to build feedback. You want that sensitivity. And I think it's harder right now. I don't know what you thought about and what you've had.
This is human beings. So give and take and feedback is important. We face a problem, we know. This is a knowledge gap between the rural and the urban. The knowledge is there, available. The brain development and in the last 20 years or 30 years, they went very fast. And for the middle class, this is a basic knowledge, how to care about their babies, read a book, tell the story before they sleep, something like that. But in the urban, no book, no this kind of the knowledge, how to help them. You see, all those knowledge is in the internet. You have a cell phone, you can learn. That's not the case. For the grandpa, before 2005 in China, this is not a compulsory education. This is the education they need to pay to go to school. That's the problem for many those grandma, grandpa. They are not well educated. So the personal contact, personal service is important for them to narrow this gap. But meanwhile, we also need to think about the possibility, how to help those home visitors. They need to learn a more new development. So now we have something in the internet they can get. But also, we talk with a company who will help us to design the AI, assistant, AI assistant for each home visitor. So this is something we think the new development of those technology can really be helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So due to time limitation, we have to conclude today's event. I want to thank you all for joining such a wonderful event. And I thank Professor Heckman and all the other panelists, and thank Professor C.S. Lee for supporting this event. So let's give a round of applause for our panelists. And see you at the next event we're going to announce later when, everything is finalized. Okay.